Anyone who concludes that the Bible is a moralistic handbook of model citizens and saints that get blessings from God for being good just need to read Genesis. That's all they have to do is to read Genesis, because Genesis absolutely blows up that notion that the Bible is a book of moral heroes that people like you and me are supposed to emulate. I mean, everyone we've read about, without exception, every single person that we've read about is messed up. Everyone. And they are afraid, they're insecure, they're deceptive, they're proud, they're selfish, they're neurotic, they're angry, they're faithless and unbelieving. They have their own agenda. Every single one of the people that we've looked at through this series is a mess. They're all train wrecks, every single one of them. And I mentioned last week that I know it sounds strange, but that actually brings me a tremendous amount of comfort. Because as I read the stories of these people, I see myself, I see you, I see me. This is God's way of saying to all of us that we are great sinners and He alone is a great Savior. And so as we've made our way through this series, we've discovered that the book of Genesis, in particular, is not a story of good people who work hard to make it up to God. It's the story of bad people that God comes down to and saves. That these are great sinners who encounter an even greater grace. And we see this again in the life of Joseph. One of my favorite stories in all the Bible. The life of Joseph, the character development of Joseph and his brothers and his father and God's invisible hand of providence behind the scenes. You know, one of my favorite parts of this story is the part where Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery, and slave traders take him away and they make their way to Egypt where they're going to sell him. And there's this little word in the Bible after Joseph is sold, which simply says, meanwhile. In other words, meanwhile, as all of this is happening, God is at work. None of this is happening by accident. This is all happening according to plan. That God is behind the scenes. He's doing something. He has not forgotten Joseph. He has not forgotten the promise that He made to Abraham concerning the birth of a family that would bless the world. This is not the end of the story. Meanwhile, and I remember hearing a preacher many years ago preach a sermon on that one word in the context of this story, as a way of simply saying, regardless of what's happening in your life, regardless of what you're facing, and regardless of what you're going through, always remember, meanwhile, God is at work behind the scenes. He's doing things that you and I cannot see, that we could never in a million years predict. C.S. Lewis once said that trying to figure out what God is doing is like taking a walk along the beach and looking out over the ocean. There's just so much more that you don't see than what you do see. You see a great expanse of water, but as far as your eye can see, that's just a small, tiny portion of the ocean. And so when we find ourselves down, despairing, depressed, when we find ourselves wondering what in the world is going on and why we are experiencing the difficulty and the pain and the trials and the tribulations that we are facing, this is a great story to go back to. Because not only do we find in the Bible at the beginning of the story, after Joseph is sold into slavery, that meanwhile, God is at work. But then the entire story is the unfolding of this remarkable plan of God behind the scenes. It reminds me in many ways of the story of Job. Okay, I mean, as you know, Job experiences great trials, great tribulations. He loses everything, his health, he loses his wealth, he loses his family, he loses everything, loses his reputation. And what we know as the reader is that God is up to something because we're privy to what happened behind the scenes. We read chapter 1 and chapter 2, and we know why Job is experiencing what he's experiencing, but neither Job nor his friends ever find out what God was up to behind the scenes. They never, ever figure out any answers to their questions why. They tried to figure it out. And God breaks through in chapter 38 and simply says, okay, I've heard your questions, now let me question you. Brace yourself like a man. This is who I am. I'm the one who laid the earth's foundations. I'm the one who told lightning where to strike and thunder where to roll. I am God, and that's all you need to know. And that's all Job needed to know. In the end, he says in chapter 42, before my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. And that's all, never, ever, ever getting an explanation for why he was suffering the way that he did. It was simply God showing himself to be God, to be big. That enabled Job to be set free. Well, we find the same sort of thing here. We kind of understand what's going on, but Joseph had no way of knowing. His brothers had no way of knowing. Jacob, their father, had no way of knowing what God was up to behind the scenes. And so we see this invisible hand of providence behind the scenes, moving things forward. We see a good God who keeps his promises, moving things forward, even though it looked like this entire experiment was going to come to an end. Well, Joseph is, at the time of his birth, the youngest of 11 boys born to Jacob. And he is a spoiled brat, okay? He is the firstborn of Jacob's favored wife, Rachel. And Jacob, his father, doesn't even try to hide his favoritism for Joseph. Doesn't even try to hide it, okay? Gives him special things, gives him special treatment. His brothers are sort of out and about doing the hard work of keeping the family business going. And, Joseph, kind of like his father, Jacob, seems to be somewhat of a mama's boy, okay? Or, in this case, a papa's boy. Okay, he seems to be the kind of kid who wakes up late and sits around the house and maybe helps out around the kitchen. But just like his dad, he doesn't really seem to be a man's man. His brothers are out there working hard in the fields. And, Joseph from time to time wanders out to where his brothers are and, flashes some of his newest gifts from dad and then goes home, okay? So what we discover as we read the story of Joseph is he's not only favored by his father, but he's an absolute spoiled brat, okay? He's the kind of younger brother that every single one of us would be turned off by and wouldn't be able to stand. And Joseph flaunts this favoritism to his brothers, okay? He doesn't try to hide it either. Not only showing off his fancy gifts from dad, but even relaying to them that famous portion of the story where he relays to them his dream that they will one day bow down to him. Now, let's just say you have a dream like that, okay? It's probably not a good idea. Just keep it to yourself, man. It's probably not a good idea to put the brand new coat that your dad gave you on, wander out to where your brothers are, do a little, sort of twirl and show them your brand new clothes that dad gave you and say, oh, by the way, before I leave and go back home and leave you guys to your work, let me tell you about this dream I had where all of you were bowing down to me. Okay, have a good day, see you later, okay? Everything that we read about Joseph makes us go, something bad's coming down the pike for this guy. And we kind of hope something bad comes down the pike for this guy. He's a spoiled brat. Well, his brothers finally have enough, and they come up with this plan to sell him to slave traders. Okay, they sort of beat him up, throw him in a pit, and They're trying to figure out what to do. Some of the brothers want to kill him. One of his brothers is like, we probably shouldn't kill him. That's bad news. And all of a sudden they see slave traders coming, and he says, I got a great idea. Let's sell him to them. We'll never have to deal with him again. And yet at the same time, we won't be guilty of murder. And so they sell him to slave traders. And then they go back. They take this coat that his dad gave him, and they dip it in blood, and they go back to their dad and say, we found this. Your son Joseph must have been killed by wild beasts. Okay, so not only do they take their brother and sell him, but then they go and lie to their dad. And Joseph gets sold in Egypt to Potiphar, who's the captain of the palace guard, and he becomes a household slave. Potiphar notices Joseph's work ethic, and Joseph actually rises to the top of, the totem pole regarding the slaves in the household. And he eventually makes Joseph the head of his household, the guy who's basically in charge of all the slaves. But Potiphar's wife, apparently Joseph was a good-looking guy, and Potiphar's wife on numerous occasions made passes at him and tried to get him to go to bed with her. And Joseph routinely says, no, 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 no. Potiphar's wife gets upset, falsely accuses him of sexual harassment. Potiphar believes his wife, is furious with Joseph. How could this guy that I've given so much responsibility to go after my wife? Believes his wife, takes Joseph and throws him into prison. Okay, so now Joseph goes to jail for doing the right thing. And years after being in prison, he became known, he had this reputation in prison of being able to interpret dreams. And years after being in prison, Pharaoh sends for Joseph because he hears that Joseph can interpret dreams. And Pharaoh himself has had some very hard to understand dreams that are haunting him, and he doesn't understand their meaning. And so he hears that there's this guy named Joseph in prison who can interpret dreams. And so he sends for Joseph, and Joseph interprets his dream. And Pharaoh is so elated by this and recognizes Joseph to be wise and discerning. And so Pharaoh makes Joseph second in command of all Egypt. Okay, it's an amazing story. Sort of riches to rags to riches, the drama involved here. Well, years later, a famine strikes the land, and Joseph's brothers come to Egypt, as I mentioned, to get food. The reason that Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of the land is because the interpretation of the dream that Pharaoh had meant that there were going to be 7 years of plenty in the land, and followed by 7 years of famine. And so Joseph comes up with this idea and recommends to Pharaoh, hey, listen, during the 7 years of plenty, let's save food, so that when the 7 years of famine come, we'll have food to get us through those 7 years. And Pharaoh says, great idea, you're in charge. So Joseph goes to work over these 7 years, and he puts tremendous amount of food in the storehouses. And so people from all over the world are coming to Egypt because they hear that's where all the food is. And so they come asking for food. And this is the portion of the story where Joseph's brothers, the famine has now hit, the 7 years of plenty are over. There have been 2 years of famine in the land. Jacob sends his sons, Joseph's brothers, to Egypt and says, go get food there. Well, little did they know, years and years and years later, that the person they were going to ask for food was their brother, who they had sold into slavery years and years earlier. Well, thinking about Joseph's life, thinking about Joseph's life is a reminder that life is hard. I mean, if you just consider the drama, just consider all that Joseph experienced, it's a reminder that life is hard, that pain is real, that human history is filled with twists and turns and horrors and unpredictable trials. I mean, the story of Joseph does not gloss over the pain of life. I mean, we have everything here. Family betrayal, favoritism, deception, slavery, fear, injustice, famine, the ache of probable starvation. I mean, you've got it all here. The Bible doesn't gloss over these things. It looks at these things and it deals with these things realistically and stares them right in the face. And so this really is a story. It's an account of real life in the real world. Anybody who concludes that the Bible is for people who don't get the real world haven't read the Bible. Okay, I've actually had people say to me, gosh, you pastors don't really understand the real world. I said, the real world? I mean, literally, I've seen more of the real world this past week in my office talking to people than you've seen in your entire life. Okay, I remember Steve Brown gave us that line when we were in seminary. If anybody comes into your office and says, you pastors don't understand the real world, just tell them this: I see more of the real world in a day than you see in a week. Okay, well, that's maybe stretching it. In his case, it's true, because he's older. But the fact of the matter is, some people claim that Christianity in general and the Bible in particular is disconnected from the real world. That it's somehow up in the clouds. It doesn't really deal with the hardness of life and the difficulty of brokenness in a broken world with other broken people. Well, here's just one example of the fact that that's just categorically false. I mean, what we deal with here in this story is real life stuff that you and I face, stuff that you and I deal with, stuff that every broken person living in this broken world with other broken people faces. We have everything here. And so this really is a story of real life in the real world. It's the story of suffering. And suffering is not just reserved for the big things. That's typically the way we think about suffering, that it's death and disease and depression and divorce. It's crises. But when we read the Bible and we experience life, we realize that suffering is much bigger than that. It's much broader than that. It includes things like unmet expectations and frustration and relational tension and shattered dreams, all things that you and I face on a daily basis. That suffering really does encompass life. Your life, my life. There has never been one pain-free moment from our birthday to our death day. Because we are broken people living in a broken world with other broken people, suffering is inevitable. Pain is unavoidable. And we see even here in this story that Joseph and his brothers and his father are dealing with, and the whole world at that point, because they're dealing with famine, are dealing with real life stuff. Well, this story of suffering is also the story of salvation. Not salvation from pain. And that's a big mistake that sometimes people inside the church make. That God promises to save us from our pain. But nowhere in the Bible does God promise to save us from our pain. In fact, when we look at the cross, as we're going to see here in a few minutes, when we look at the cross, what we discover is a God who saves sinners through pain. And we see that here so clearly, so compellingly. Not only the story of suffering, but it's the story of salvation. Well, I want to talk a little bit about suffering this morning, because that really is what's going on here. And I want to tie it into this narrative, this story of Joseph's life and what he dealt with concerning his brothers and all of those things. But I want to note that there are basically two ways. There are only two ways that you and I can view suffering. Suffering is an everyday reality for all of us, and it's very important for us to understand how to view it, how to approach it, how to understand it, because there are primarily two ways that we view suffering, that we approach suffering. We can either view it according to law, and I'll explain that in a minute, or we can view it according to grace. Okay, and we're all viewing it in one of these two ways, whether you realize it or not. Life by law, and you've heard me say this before. Let me just explain what I mean. I'll get back to approaching suffering via law and grace in a minute, but let me just kind of define for a minute what I mean by life by law, okay? Life by law seems very, very safe because it breeds a sense of manageability. It keeps life formulaic and predictable. Okay, we maintain control. The outcome of our life remains in our hands. What do I mean? This. Give me 3 steps to a happy marriage, and I can guarantee a happy marriage if I follow these 3 steps. Okay, that's life by law. Unfortunately, that's the kind of thing that preachers preach week in and week out. They don't even realize that they're placing huge burdens on the shoulders of sinful people, but the fact of the matter is this is life by law. Tell me what I need to do to ensure that I can get the good stuff and avoid the bad stuff. Give me a checklist of things, because that way I can guarantee that if I successfully carry out all the items on the checklist, I can pretty much guarantee that I can avoid the bad stuff and I can get the good stuff. My life is in my hands. I maintain control. I like the formula, okay? That's what I mean when I talk about life by law. Well, approaching suffering according to the logic of law puts the burden on us to clean up our act, to get things right, to fix ourselves and others. When you suffer, when I suffer, when we face difficulty, when we face hard things, we are by nature addicted to law, because what happens in you and what happens in me is this. Good people get good stuff and bad people get bad stuff. Bad things are happening. I need to fix what's wrong. Okay? And so we automatically take this burden on ourselves and we go into fix-it mode. Okay? We go into, I've got to clean up my act mode. I've got to fix things. I've got to fix myself. I have to fix other people. I will only experience freedom. I will only experience redemption. I will only experience cleansing if I get to work on cleaning up my act, fixing things that are wrong. And it forces us to conclude that we're suffering because we've done something wrong. Maybe we're not praying enough, or we're not obeying enough, or we're not giving enough, or whatever the case may be. I mean, we do this all the time. This is what happens naturally. Okay, I mean, you may not say this out loud, but I'm sure you've thought this in your mind. You know, you see a rebellious teenager, and you automatically think to yourself, I wonder what their parents did wrong. Were they too strict, or maybe they weren't strict enough? We find ourselves in the same position of Job's friends. Job, we understand the way the world works. Good people get good stuff and bad people get bad stuff. You're clearly getting bad stuff. What did you do wrong? Okay. Or Jesus' disciples in Mark chapter 9, encountering a man born blind and saying, Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? I mean, obviously, blindness happens as a direct result of punishment from God for doing something wrong. So Jesus, our only question is, who messed up, his parents or him, that he was cursed and disciplined and punished with blindness? Okay, that's our natural default mode. I mean, I have literally found myself having a bad day, and you have too. I've found myself having a bad day, and I go through the catalog in my mind of things that I could have done better that naturally caused this bad day. So maybe if I would have actually listened more intently to what Kim was saying this morning when I was kind of ignoring her. Maybe if I would have, been kinder to my kids and not blown them off. Maybe if I would have gotten up a little bit earlier this morning and prayed a little bit longer. Maybe if I would have read, instead of 1 chapter of the Bible, if I would have read 3 chapters of the Bible. I mean, it's just natural for us to conclude that we're suffering something bad because God is punishing us. Okay, that's how we approach suffering according to the logic of law. Saturday Night Live, okay? I know some of you will probably think that the glory days of Saturday Night Live were, the 80s, the early 80s. All of you guys, you're very self-righteous about this. For those of you who ever watched Saturday Night Live, Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi, those were the glory days, the good old days, okay? The glory days of Saturday Night Live were the 90s, early 90s, specifically Adam Sandler and Chris Farley and those guys, okay? That was the glory days. Well, during the early 90s, there was this skit that maybe if you watch Saturday Night Live, Any of you watch Saturday Night Live? Okay. Jeez. This needs to become a church that watches Saturday Night Live, all right? Not anymore. It's not even good anymore. A couple weeks ago it was pretty funny, but it's really not good anymore. It's pretty dumb. But there was this skit back in the early 90s. Maybe you remember it, Deep Thoughts with Jack Handy, okay? And it was so dumb. I mean, it was nonsensical comments from this guy who was supposed to be deep and philosophical. Well, that was such a huge hit, those skits, that Saturday Night Live actually put together a book and compiled all of Jack Handy's deep thoughts, and it was just called Deep Thoughts. Here's one of them, and this one fits perfectly into what I'm talking about. He says, if a kid asks where rain comes from, I think a cute thing to tell him is, God is crying. And if he asks why God is crying, another cute thing to tell him is, probably because of something you did, okay? Now, we laugh at that, okay, because it's so dumb. But the fact of the matter is, most of us are naturally governed by this kind of thinking regarding God. Most of us are. This is our natural default mode. This is how we think about God. When we subscribe to a law-driven, this for that paradigm of cosmic scorekeeping, we're no longer talking about Christianity. In fact, what we're actually talking about in that case is karma. What goes around comes around. You know that God is doling out misery in direct proportion to the mistakes that we've made. Okay, that's the way we think. You know, we suffer something tragic, and life by law or approaching suffering by law forces us to go, I must be getting punished for something I've done bad. What do I need to do to get it right? That's what Job's friends were offering Job. You want the good stuff again? You want to be blessed? Well, come on, Job. Just tell us what skeletons are in your closet. It's like the worst form of the worst kind of accountability group. You ever been in one of those groups, where I was in one in college, and there are good accountability groups, okay? I'm not talking about not having good friends who know you and live life with you. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the kind of accountability group where, a group of people meet together on a weekly basis, a group of friends meet together on a weekly basis, and they just dig and dig and dig and dig and dig and dig and dig, and, they want you to confess your deepest, darkest sins, and it doesn't matter how deep and how dark the sins are that you confess, they keep digging because they think there's something deeper, and you almost get the impression that they're digging because they want to find something so bad that they actually feel better about themselves, okay? There's very little talk of the fact that Christ saves sinners, and a lot of talk about, our mistakes, what we've done wrong, how to get ourselves clean, how to fix ourselves, and that sort of thing. Well, this is Job's friends, okay? This is, come on, Job, tell us, what have you done wrong? Come on, if you want the good stuff, get clean, okay? Well, that is as we approach suffering through law. It's exactly what it compels us to do. And this is the way that we typically read Joseph's story. He's getting what he deserves. What comes around goes around. We side with his brothers. There's a part of us that goes, okay, that's a little harsh, selling your own brother into slavery, but let's be honest, man. This little brat had it coming, all right? And the whole and entire reason that Joseph gets beat up and sold to slave traders and eventually goes to prison and all of that stuff, the whole reason is because God's trying to teach him a lesson. What we hear from God himself in this story is that's not what's going on. Okay? There was something that God was up to behind the scenes that dictated this particular script. And so the law impacts our understanding of suffering by persuading us to conclude that good people get good stuff and bad people get bad stuff, and if we want to avoid bad stuff, we have to be good. Okay? Well, on the opposite end of the spectrum is approaching suffering according to grace. Because grace fundamentally rejects the conditionality of karma. Okay, listen carefully here. Grace affirms that Jesus severed the link between suffering and deserving once and for all on the cross. That at the cross, God put the ledgers away and settled the accounts. And what that means is to conclude that God is in the business of distributing misery in direct proportion to our bad behavior is anti-gospel. Absolutely anti-gospel. The good news of the gospel is not that good people get good stuff. The good news of the gospel, as I said a number of weeks ago, is that the bad get the best. The worst inherit the wealth. The slave becomes a son. It turns everything we understand naturally upside down. Okay, the radicality of God's amazing grace turns everything that makes sense to us upside down. Everything that makes sense, what goes around comes around, he had it coming. All of that stuff is life by law. Life by grace, approaching suffering and pain and brokenness through the lens of grace, turns everything upside down because the gospel shouts, it announces, it pronounces, bad people get the best, okay? The slave becomes a son. The worst inherit the wealth. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. It's simply the gospel. While we were at our worst, God gave us his best. Okay, that's the gospel. And so if we read this story or interpret our lives in this way, well, okay, in order for me to experience the good stuff again, then I have to get myself clean. I am suffering in direct proportion to what I've done wrong. Thankfully, that's not true for any of us, okay? I mean, every human being deserves hell, which is a lot worse than a bad day. So regardless of what mistakes you've made, even then you're not experiencing, in direct proportion to the mistakes you've made, the punishment that we deserve. Okay, so concluding that bad people get bad stuff and good people get good stuff, and if I want to get the good stuff, I have to be good. If I want to avoid the bad stuff, I have to be good, is anti-gospel. Now, without understanding the radicality of this amazing grace, we become vulnerable to joylessness in times of trial. So let me say this, okay, and I'm going to tie this into Joseph and his brothers and how God set them free. Suffering cannot rob you of joy. It's impossible. Only idolatry can. Idolatry alone can rob you of joy in times of trial and seasons of ache. Suffering can't. Hard circumstances, difficulty, pain, none of those things can actually rob you of joy. But what can rob you of joy is idolatry. So if you're suffering and you're angry and bitter and joyless, it means that you've idolized whatever it is you're losing. You're losing something, or you're afraid to lose something that you don't think you can live without. Joylessness and bitterness in the crucible of pain happens when we lose something that we're holding on to more tightly than God. Now, both Joseph and his brothers are absolutely guilty of this, okay? Joseph's brothers' rage was fueled by the fact that they felt they deserved more favor than they were getting. I mean, that's really what it was. They were sons of Jacob too. They were entitled. And the very fact that Joseph was favored among all the brothers is what fueled their rage. They deserved more attention. They deserved more favor than they were getting. They weren't getting noticed. They weren't getting the attention from dad that they felt like they deserved. That's what fueled their rage. If they were absolutely secure in who God made them to be, if their identity was ultimately anchored in their relationship to God, then Jacob could spoil Joseph and Joseph could flaunt his favoritism, and it would not have robbed the brothers of joy, because they didn't need Jacob's favor to feel like they mattered. They didn't need to be noticed to feel like they mattered. They didn't need attention from Dad to feel like they mattered. They would have been able to not only forgive Dad for his indiscretion of giving favoritism to Joseph, but they would have also been able to just sort of tolerate Joseph. But they get so enraged, angry, and bitter because they feel like they need this in order for life to matter, in order for them to feel established and justified and validated and happy and satisfied, and they're not getting it. So what do? They get rid of Joseph. They actually think that their greatest problem is outside of them. And so they do what they can to get rid of the outside problem. Well, that's what the world tells you. The world tells you and me that your greatest problem is outside of you, and the only solution is inside of you. Your greatest problem is outside of you. It's your husband, it's your wife, it's your kids, it's your boss, it's whoever, okay? It's circumstantial, and the only solution is inside of you. You got to figure out a way to fix these people and manipulate your circumstances, and then you'll be happy and free. Well, the gospel tells us just the opposite. Okay, the Bible tells us that our greatest problem is inside of us, and the only solution comes from outside. So Joseph's brothers get it wrong. Not only have they idolized favor and idolized attention and idolized being noticed, and when they didn't get it and that was being stripped away, they get mad, they get joyless, they get angry, they want revenge. That happens to them, obviously, but they wrongly conclude the biggest problem's out here. It's him. That's the problem. So let's just get rid of him and we'll finally be free. We'll be able to sort of settle in and settle down, and we'll be happy and joyful all over again. Well, Joseph, on the other hand, Joseph's pride, and he was this spoiled, proud little brat. Joseph's pride was ultimately anchored in his believing that he was better than his brothers. He believed his own press. He's on the other end of the spectrum. He's getting so much attention from Dad, and he's getting so much special treatment from Dad, that he actually starts believing his own press. I really am more special. And his entire identity becomes anchored in, his favored identity. I must be important because Dad loves me the most. I must be important because I get these gifts. I am better than you. Well, all of this begins to change for Joseph and his brothers. God begins to strip away those things that both his brothers and Joseph were banking on to make life worth living, to make them feel like they mattered. Both Joseph and his brothers were relying on something smaller than God to establish themselves, to make them feel like they were important. And when it was taken away, Joseph's brothers get angry, and Joseph becomes afraid. Very, very afraid. Anger and fear is what happens when we lose something we don't think we can live without. Something that we think makes us who we are. But as you read the story, you discover something beautiful. That like us, God was saving them by killing them, prying open their hands and taking from them what they thought they needed in order to be happy and valuable and justified. I mean, Joseph's hard life brought him to the end of himself, absolutely to the end of himself. Suffering showed him that he wasn't all that special, showed him that he wasn't a real big shot, that he was small, that he was needy, that he wasn't as in control as he thought he was. None of his manipulative power, none of his believing his own press made a difference in the pit, didn't make a difference in prison. All of these hard circumstances humbled him and showed him that God is God and he is not, that God alone is sufficient and he in and of himself is deficient. And so God killed him, and in the process of killing him, taking away that thing that he was banking on to make him feel important, to make him feel like he mattered, in taking that away, God was setting him free. So often in your life and mine, God seems to be killing us when he's actually saving us. He takes those things away from us that can never deliver what they promise, that can never ever deliver what we ultimately long for: meaning and value and worth and justification and validation and all of those things. All of those things which, believe it or not, fuel almost every single one of our pursuits. What fuels almost every single one of our pursuits is this down deep hunger for meaning. That if I can just accomplish this, or if I can just do this, or if people can just know me as being this, if I can just score this, if I can attain that, then I'll be somebody. Then I'll get respect. And if I get respect, and if I can be known as being this person, maybe then I'll finally be free. I'll be saved. All of these self-salvation projects that ultimately fail. Well, Joseph's hard life destroyed his idol, destroyed all of his self-salvation projects. He became small. He was humbled. Pain brought him to the end of himself. Pain actually opened his eyes to see God. Look with me at Genesis chapter 50, a couple pages over. Jacob dies, and Joseph's brothers are now scared. Okay, some time has passed, and Joseph's brothers wonder whether or not Joseph let them live just to honor their father. What a terrible thing it would have been for Jacob had one of his sons, Joseph, who had the power to put to death all of his other sons, actually exercise that power. The last days of Jacob's life would have seen one son exact revenge on his other sons. And so his brothers are thinking to themselves, now that dad is dead, we're history. This guy, Joseph, who has the power to kill all of us, he's the second in command of, all of Egypt, is going to have us killed. He's going to put us to death. And so Jacob dies. His brothers are afraid, thinking that, now our end is nigh. And beginning in verse 19, Joseph says to his brothers, chapter 50, verse 19, but Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them, and he spoke kindly to them. Grief taught Joseph grace. Here's a guy who had all the power he could want to exact revenge. And in one sense would probably be justified in doing so. After all, his brothers should pay for their crimes. This is just justice being meted out. And yet, because of all the pain and the grief and the trials and the tribulations that Joseph himself faced, God bringing him to the end of himself and bringing him to the beginning of grace, Joseph learned what it meant to be forgiven, and therefore he was able to forgive. It was pain that opened his eyes to see God. There is nothing like pain that opens our eyes to see God. Joseph's able to say, listen, don't be afraid, okay? You meant it for evil, I know. But God meant it for good. My pain has helped me to see the God behind the scenes who does things that at the time we don't understand and we can't figure out. But it was his pain, it was his agony, it was his suffering, it was the hardness of life that opened his eyes, very much like Job, before my ears had heard of you. I'd heard of you and I believed in you, but it was the pain and the trial and the tribulation that opened Job's eyes to be able to say, but now my eyes have seen you. Now I know you. because I've been brought to the end of myself. And as you've heard me say before, it's only when we come to the end of ourselves that we come to the beginning of God. Pain has a way of reminding us that we're small, that we're needy. That happened with Joseph. Joseph acknowledges here in chapter 50 that God did not save him from suffering, but God was there in his suffering. Okay, that's so important for us sufferers to remember, that we serve a God who not only suffered for us, but we serve a God who suffers with us. We have a great high priest, Hebrews tells us, that can sympathize with all of our weaknesses and all of our difficulties and all of our hardships, because this second person of the Trinity, God, took on human flesh and frailties. He walked a mile in our shoes. He knows what it's like to live in a fallen world with other broken people and experience injustice and betrayal and all of those things. And so Christian people serve a God, we worship a God who not only suffers for us, but who suffers with us. And that's what Joseph's able to say here. Listen, God was with me all the way. I know that you intended it for evil, and I got to be honest, in the bottom of that pit, I'm wondering what in the world is going on here. And yet he's able to say now, having experienced all of the pain that he experienced, God was with me. God was with me the whole time. You see, I didn't know then, but I know now that God brought me here because the whole world would have perished, and more specifically, God's people would have perished of starvation if God had not brought Joseph to Egypt, if Pharaoh had not had this dream that Joseph alone was able to interpret, and because he was able to interpret it, Pharaoh put him in charge, and Joseph put this plan together to save up enough food in the 7 years of plenty so that the world could be fed in the 7 years of famine. And in doing so, God used that to preserve his people so that they wouldn't starve to death. In other words, the story of redemption continues. Joseph's able to see that. And he's able to say, God didn't save me from suffering, but he was with me in my suffering, and God saved all of us through my suffering. It's amazing. Only people who have been broken can see God's hand in that way. Only people who have been broken, only people who have suffered. You know, I've never, ever once met a person who has been brought to their knees and flattened, who in some way resist God's grace. You know, the people who I find giving a lot of butts and breaks to the whole notion of God's grace are the people who quite frankly think that they're pulling it off, you know? And, but when, and I love this is always the case with parents with very small kids. They're very idealistic, as I was. Okay, and then you have teenagers and they go off script, and you realize, okay, maybe I didn't have it all figured out, and maybe no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't protect them all the time from all of the stuff that is in this broken world and all of those things. This happens all the time. But then, as it's happened in my life, as it's happened in many of your lives, then, things don't go according to plan. Things go off script. You realize that your agenda hasn't panned out. This isn't the way that you wrote it down. And God breaks you. And he makes you as well feel that you're small and needy and not as in control as you thought you were. And that's when broken people learn God's grace. That's when they get it. When they finally realize that everything I need in Christ I have. And even though I face terrible things and difficult things in this broken world, nothing in this world can take away from me what ultimately justifies me and establishes me and invests my life with meaning and with worth. And so for Joseph and us, suffering brings us to the place of honesty. He believed his own press, thought he was a big deal. Suffering brought him to the place of honesty. I'm really not that big of a deal. Suffering brings us to the place of honesty, which is the place of desperation, which is the place of faith, which is the place of freedom. I mean, as I said, he learned grace through grief. In fact, it was through Joseph's pain and suffering that grace and forgiveness came to Joseph's brothers. It's amazing. Joseph's brothers were scared. And they knew down deep that they deserved to be punished. But Joseph's extension of unconditional love and forgiveness melted their hearts and ultimately set them free. Well, how did all that happen? Because Joseph himself was broken and learned grace through grief. Well, years later, another favored son would be betrayed, sold into captivity, mistreated by his own. John chapter 1 says that Jesus came to his own and his own did not receive him. In this sense, Jesus really is the truer and better Joseph who at the right hand of the king forgives those who betrayed and sold him and uses his new power to save them. Like Joseph, it is through Jesus' pain and suffering that grace and forgiveness come to the undeserving. So this is a remarkable story, but it's ultimately a story about Christ and his cross. A favored son who would be betrayed, sold by one of his brothers, Judas. Betrayed, sold, mistreated by the ones that he came to help. And now being exalted at the right hand of the king, at the right hand of his father, forgives those, you and me, who betrayed him, who sold him, who mistreated him, who ignore him, and he uses this power to save them. Joseph had the power to either kill or save his brothers. And he used his power to save them. Let me just conclude with this, and I think it's an apt way to finish this series. It's a short poem that I came across the other day that just rang with such truth and depth and reminds us once again that this whole thing is about God who rescues sinners. Not only all of Genesis, but Genesis through Revelation is all about a God who saves sinners like you and me. The Bible is not fundamentally a book about you and me and what we're to do. It's fundamentally a book about God and what he's done. Behold the mercy of our King who takes from death its bitter sting, and by his blood, and often ours, brings triumph out of hostile powers. What we have lost, God will restore, that and himself forevermore. He died to finish up his art, the quiet worship of our heart. It won't be long before the rod becomes the tender kiss of God. God in Christ took our sin, took our betrayal. He took all of the ways that we not only mistreated him, but mistreat each other. He took the penalty for us on his own shoulders. And now he shouts to broken people like you and me, "It is finished. You are free."